know that when we get people right, we get business right. So I'd like to welcome you back to my podcast that focuses on 3 areas I specialise in: leadership, performance, and culture. You'll hear my guests talking about their experiences and expertise, and will be providing thought-provoking insights around putting the human factor back into business. Each conversation will be accompanied by a free downloadable guide to save the strain on your memory, and resources that will make it easier to put the great ideas we discuss into action. I'm your host, Lisa, psychologist, psychotherapist, and founder of It's Time for Change, and I thrive on conversations that make a difference. So reach out to me. My details are in the show notes along with the resources. Grab a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. In December, I recorded an episode about the 5 unseen people challenges leaders must face in 2026, outlining some of the key issues leaders are up against. This episode is all about how leaders should respond to those challenges so that their teams can perform well. So, today it's just me again. No guest, but a shorter listen that's packed full of useful insight to help you make the shifts needed for the year ahead. Let's dive in. Today, I want to talk about what high-performing teams will do differently as we head into 2026. Not in the sense of new tools, faster processes, or productivity hacks, but in how performance itself is created and sustained. Because one of the strongest patterns I'm seeing across organisations right now is this: teams are working incredibly hard, but performance is starting to feel more fragile. Decision making feels slower, energy is lower, leaders feel under pressure to have answers, and many people are coping rather than thriving. When I look at what's driving this, both in my own work and in recent research, it's not a lack of ambition or capability. It's that many teams are still being led using models that don't fit the conditions they're now operating in. So today, I want to explore some of the less obvious shifts high-performing teams are making, and why doing less, creating more space, and leading differently are becoming performance advantages rather than risks. One phrase I've come across recently really resonated with me: zombie leadership. Leadership approaches that should have died years ago but keep shambling on. These are models built on constant urgency, control, speed, individual expertise, and leaders having answers rather than creating space. They persist not because they work, but because under pressure, people default to what feels familiar. Under stress, organisations don't innovate, they revert. So leaders push harder, add more meetings, launch more initiatives, increase the pace. But what often happens is lots of movement with very little progress. Energy drains, thinking narrows, and performance becomes brittle. It might look fine on the surface for a while, but it's harder to sustain. High-performing teams are starting to recognise that these old habits aren't just tiring, they quietly undermine performance by suppressing thinking, learning, and real contribution. And that brings me to one of the most counterintuitive shifts leaders are making right now: doing less to achieve more. Not less ambition and not lower standards, but less noise. More work is not creating more clarity. More urgency is not creating better decisions. And without clarity, performance becomes inconsistent and fragile. What's missing in many teams is space. Space to think, space to reflect, space to prioritize, space to notice what's actually happening rather than reacting to everything. One of the most helpful ways I've seen this captured comes from Winnie the Pooh by A.A. Milne. And this is a quote: "Here is Edward Bear, coming downstairs now, bump, 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 on the back of his head, behind Christopher Robin. It is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs. But sometimes he feels that there really is another way, if only he could stop bumping for a moment and think of it. That image feels uncomfortably familiar in many organisations. Leaders and teams often keep bumping down the stairs, repeating the same patterns, habits, and responses, not because they're effective, but because they're familiar. The same defaults, the same reactions, the same sense of urgency. And yet, sometimes the most powerful move is to stop bumping for a moment and to think. Busyness has quietly becoming Busyness has quietly become a proxy for value, and it's costing organisations judgment, creativity, and wisdom. When leaders create space, quality improves. When they don't, effort multiplies without impact. This shift fundamentally changes what leadership looks like. For a long time, leaders have been rewarded for being decisive, knowledgeable, and solution focused. But in complex systems, that model starts to break down. The most effective leaders now aren't those with the best answers, they're those who can facilitate thinking. They ask better questions. They slow conversations down. They surface assumptions. They create psychological safety for challenge and learning. High-performing teams don't bottleneck thinking through one leader, they distribute it. And when thinking is distributed, decisions improve and performance becomes more resilient. Leadership becomes less about expertise and more about orientation, how you show up, how you listen, how you hold uncertainty. This shift can feel deeply uncomfortable, especially for experienced leaders whose identity has been built around competence and certainty. But without it, teams struggle to adapt, learn, and perform well under pressure. There's also a very human reason this matters. Another theme that keeps coming up is the cost of constant cognitive overload. Always being on, always responsive, always reacting. When people are overloaded, judgment deteriorates, emotional regulation drops, learning shuts down. Performance may look fine in the short term, but it rarely holds. And no app or supplement or productivity hack fixes that. High-performing teams understand that human energy and attention are finite resources. Leaders who protect focus, boundaries, and recovery aren't being soft, they're being strategic. This is where well-being and performance stop being separate conversations, because one directly affects the other. So what does all this mean as we move into 2026? The forces shaping performance aren't just technological. They are relational, psychological, and systematic. So high-performing teams will be those where leaders do less, more intentionally. They step back from constant expertise. They create space for thinking and learning. They manage energy and attention, not just output. And they trust people rather than control them. The future of leadership isn't louder or faster, it's wiser. So as you look ahead to 2026, I want to offer a few practical ways to translate this into action, not as a checklist, but as a shift in how you lead. You might start by asking yourself, where are we defaulting to speed when what we actually need is clarity? You might start by asking yourself, where are we defaulting to speed when what we actually need is clarity? Where are decisions being made too quickly for good thinking to happen? Where might we be mistaking activity for progress? And here are a few small but meaningful actions high-performing teams are already taking. They create fewer, better meetings, being ruthless about purpose. They build pauses into decision-making, not delays, but moments to think. They shift from giving answers to asking better questions like, what might we be missing? They protect energy, not just output, and notice when overload creeps in. And they model doing less visibly so that others have permission to do the same. Because sustainable high performance doesn't come from pushing harder, it comes from leading differently. So, as you look ahead to 2026, I'll leave you with a final reflection. Where might you be adding noise instead of clarity? Where could you step back to let others step forward? And what would happen if doing less became a leadership strength rather than a risk? Because sustainable high performance doesn't come from pushing harder, it comes from leading differently. If you want support making that shift for yourself, your leaders, or your organisation, you know where to find me. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, there are 3 things I invite you to do. First, click the link in the show notes to download the resources for this episode. Secondly, help me extend the reach of this podcast by leaving a quick review on Apple or wherever you listen. And please share this episode with your colleagues so that you can discuss what resonates for your team. And finally, as usual, I invite you to reach out to me on LinkedIn or through my website so that we can keep the conversation flowing. I know listeners often say they're keen to implement some of the key takeaways, but sometimes find it tough without guidance or extra support. If that's you, drop me a line and let's chat. My brand spanking new website is live in January, ready for 2026. So be sure to check out itstimefforchange.co.uk, where you will find a whole heap more to support you to reflect on and develop your own practice. And while you're there, join my mailing list to stay up to date with bespoke support services like my retained partnerships, where I'm by your side through all things leadership, culture and performance. Feel free to reach out if you want to know more. I'm a great sounding board for challenges and ideas for development, so grab all the details you need from the show notes. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to the next episode coming soon. Join me then.